This next presentation is a follow-up to a presentation from last month. WSP reviewed some alignment alternatives related to the Regional Rapid Transit project. And so Scott Pringle is with us again today to review those with you again.
Okay, Scott, you're recognized. Thank you.
Good morning, Scott Pringle with WSP, representing the Regional Rapid Transit team. Chris, if you could advance the slide, please. So just as David mentioned, today is a continuation of basically a 3-month-long conversation with the board as it pertains to the results of Milestone 2. Next slide, please. So as we kind of discussed in May, what the request for the June board meeting is to advance a total of 3 alternatives out of the 5 that we've been reviewing in Milestone 2 into the next phase of the project, which is Milestone 3. In Milestone 3, we begin to look at environmental and community impacts and effects of these 3 alternatives that we advance forward, as well as begin the conversation about sort of station design concepts. Next slide, please. So as we discussed in May, with the first alternative, which is our baseline alternative, which really is more akin to an express bus service along the entire length of the corridor connecting St. Pete to Wesley Chapel. In May, we asked the board to consider advancing Milestone 1 or Alternative 1 to Milestone 3 because it really provides our low-cost alternative, especially when we're looking at very minimal investment in the interstate alignment from a project perspective. And it really does go a long way in providing that point of comparison as we start talking about some of the more capital-intensive alternatives. Next slide, please. So here's a few of the statistics as it relates to alternative 1 or that baseline alternative. However, I will come back to these items as we go through the following slides because I'm going to always use alternative 1 in comparison to alternatives 2 through 5. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, if the board is comfortable with moving forward with alternative 1, then the decision comes to picking 2 of these 4 alternatives. Just as we discussed in May and April, you can see starting from the left, moving to the right, is the recommendation from the planning phase or the Regional Transit Feasibility Plan. Alternative 3 looks at adding freeway BRT lanes up in what I've been kind of affectionately describing as the Pasco Gap, connecting all the way into Pasco County, whereas Alternative 4 looks at dedicated freeway BRT lanes across the Howard Franklin Bridge, and Alternative 5 pulls both of those together. Next slide, please. So one thing I did want to bring to the board today, and it's something that I truly believe it represents an innovation that this project is going to bring forward. We're at the starting point of the development of this concept, and we'll continue to investigate it as we work towards what we call our proof of concept for the operating plan for this project. And what we're looking and what we're seeing from the data is that what makes the most sense for this project is what we call a branch operating system. And now what that means is that we can use that core alignment of the interstate, but have multiple routes that serve a number of different travel markets along this long corridor, this 41-mile corridor. And we call it a branch operating system because in key locations, the idea is that the service actually leaves the interstate and branches out into the neighborhoods to make good connections or that seamless connection to local transit, whether it's in Pasco, Pinellas, or Hillsborough County. So a really good example of that is when we look to the right hand of the screen, you can see the northern portion of the corridor. And a great example is in Pasco County. The idea is that, where we're near State Route 54 at the beginning of the route, we actually make some of those connections to Pasco County Transit, hop on the alignment, and then we get an express service that connects us right to the USF area and right to downtown Tampa. And what we're seeing is that we have opportunities for at least 2 to 3 different routes per primary travel market. And the core travel markets are St. Pete to Tampa, Wesley Chapel to Tampa, and then we have an intermediate corridor or travel market that really connects the Bears USF area through downtown Tampa and into the West Shore area. So with that, next slide, please. So keeping in mind that branch operating system, you can see the travel time shown here, including the first alternative, that baseline alternative. And in the dark blue columns or chart bars is that Tampa to St. Pete travel market. And some of the variations in the travel time is because of that branch operating system, where you have a little bit of extra time when you're offline, making those good connections to local transit. But then once you're on the alignment, you're getting express service to TIA or to downtown Tampa. Now, where we see the greatest deviation in time is the Wesley Chapel to Tampa corridor. Keep in mind, we had two sort of route patterns there, the connecting Wesley Chapel to Tampa and then the university area to West Shore. And when we have opportunity to either connect directly to USF or deviate and connect into some of the neighborhoods in Pasco County, it does create a scenario. We do have additional travel time, but the idea is that you have that connection, get on the corridor and make those express service connections. So the operating system is across all three, is comparable. So when we look at the dark blue columns, working our way from the baseline up to alternative 5, you can see when we add the investment of the freeway BRT lanes in Pinellas County from St. Pete to the Gandy area, Gateway area, we are seeing about a 5 to 6 minute time savings, travel time saving as compared to the baseline. Obviously, this doesn't change when we go to alternative 3, which is filling the Pasco gap because this is focused on Tampa to St. Pete. But when we do add freeway BRT lanes across the Howard Franklin Bridge, and we discussed those costs at the last meeting, we do see an additional travel time savings of up to 10 to 11 minutes for that additional investment across the bridge. Now looking at the light blue bars, so this is Wesley Chapel to downtown Tampa. Again, working our way across the alternatives. Alternative 2, we do see a benefit, and this includes that gap in Pasco County, where we're seeing the 7 to 12 minute travel time savings as compared to alternative 1. Whereas when we add freeway BRT lanes to sort of fill that gap in Pasco, we are seeing that 12 to 19 minute travel time savings with that investment alternative. And then again, you'll notice that alternatives number 2 and 4 are very similar for this travel market. Keep in mind, this is just Wesley Chapel to Tampa. Whereas when we put all the items together, including the bridge and filling the Pasco gap, again, you can see the travel time saving there of 12 to 19 minutes from Wesley Chapel to downtown Tampa. Next slide, please. Oop. So as a result of that branch operating system, what we're seeing on the ridership side, again, working our way from left to right, alternative 1, we're looking at a total daily ridership of over 4,000 riders just for the express bus service. Really kind of speaks to the importance of this corridor. That daily ridership is actually very similar to what Orlando is seeing on Sunrail today. So great regional project. And then we start adding the investment. Alternative 2, we see that increase up to 5,800 riders for alternative 2. And we do see an increase in what we call those choice riders, which are people who may not have otherwise taken transit, getting up to 2,800 riders per day with that alternative. Alternative 3, 6,700 riders per day, 3,400 choice riders. Alternative 4, about 6,000 riders per day. And then of course, alternative 5, which is our high cost investment, but also represents the greatest ridership benefit at 7,600 riders per day. Next slide, please. So these are the benefits of the project bring, and this is really a derivative of that ridership forecast that I just presented to you. This first slide is the reduction in vehicle miles traveled annually. I'm not going to go and read off each one of the numbers, but you can see the pattern's similar because again, it's following the ridership forecast that we're seeing on these alternatives. Whereas we see a benefit for alternative 2, greater benefit for alternative 3, and then when you combine both the freeway BRT lanes across the bridge and up to Pasco County, in alternative 5, that's our highest reduction in vehicle miles traveled. Next slide, please. So this is metric ton equivalents per year in greenhouse gas reductions. Very similar to the conversation about vehicle miles traveled reduction, same patterns here. Alternative 2, 2,300 metric ton equivalents annually as we work our way up to alternative 5 at the highest end at 3,600 metric ton equivalents annually. Next slide, please. So this is, and again, we had a great conversation in May in regards to the alignment costs. What you see here is in the first row from left to right is the alignment cost, station capital cost estimates for each one of these alternatives. So that's the alignment and stations combined. You'll see some minimal investment at stations for alternative 1, the TSM alternative, and then as we discussed in May, escalating as we move through alternatives 2 through 5. The second row, we're actually showing the transit fleet costs and the maintenance facility costs, but it also includes things like professional services, a contingency budget or reserve, which is a percentage of the overall capital cost. So you can see here, so the transit fleet, there are some costs associated with running the express bus service across the corridor and alternative 1, and then escalating as we get to alternatives 4 and 5, where you can see the highest cost. And again, that's both a result of the fleet capital to run that service and that alternative, but also includes those contingencies and those reserve pots. And you can see the combination of the two. In comparison to what we saw in the planning phase during the regional transit feasibility plan, we estimated about $455 million for the project cost, whereas alternatives 1, 2, and 3 are actually below that estimate. And then when we talk about adding going across the bridge, the Howard Franklin Bridge, we do add that additional cost, which is putting us higher than that original planning estimate. So next slide, please. Oops. So what we're showing here is some of the targets that we're going to start working on in developing a financial plan for the project, which includes how much federal investment we could get from the Capital Investment Grant Program that FTA had put out, and the number of phases that we anticipate the project to be built in. So when we look at alternative 1, the baseline scenario, that is not necessarily applicable for the Capital Investment Grant Program for FTA. There are other federal programs out there, but we're just kind of focused on the CIG program. And without that federal share, there is an opportunity for some state funding. By policy, it's capped at 12.5% in the absence of federal funding, leaving the vast majority of the responsibility on the local share at 87.5%. But then as you work our way through alternatives 2 through number 5, we are showing that opportunity for federal funding. You can see some of the percentages here, which is related to how we phase the project. And the idea is to try to maximize our federal contribution as much as possible to sort of leverage and lower the responsibility on especially the local financial requirements. And then of course, looking for that state match to the local dollars. When we talk about the phases, you can see that we're 1 to 2 phases for alternative 1. Alternatives 2 and 3, we're anticipating 2 to 3 phases, which will be tied directly to the TBNEX program. And then as we move on to alternatives 4 and 5, which is filling the gap across the Howard Franklin Bridge, we think that would require an additional phase beyond the TBNEX program. So next slide, please. So to date, we've had the opportunity to talk to a number of different folks, the business working group, as well as the station working group, our executive team. What we heard back from the business stakeholders was pretty clear consensus from the group that they were very interested in advancing alternatives 3 and 5. The station stakeholder group, also some great conversations there, some interest in alternatives 2, 3, and 5. And the executive team we met with late last week also recommended moving forward with 1, 3, and 5. So at this point, this concludes my presentation. Next slide, please, Chris. And as I mentioned, the recommendation to move into milestone 3 with the following 3 alternatives, which is the baseline alternative 1, the mid-level investment, which is really alternative 3, which fills that Pasco gap with freeway BRT lanes. And then the high-level investment, which does both the Howard Franklin Bridge and Pasco as alternative 5. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll take any questions.
Mr. Chair, you're muted, and I would like Commissioner Seal has her hand raised.
Oh, sorry about that. Yes, Commissioner Seal is recognized.
Thank you. I believe Secretary Gwynn is on the Zoom as well. And my question is, a lot of alternative 3 and 5 depend on Tampa Bay Next being implemented and investing in these corridors as well as changes in the Howard Franklin Bridge. So my question for the Tampa Bay Next project is, is the footprint going to remain in the same concrete footprint for that project? And the reason I'm asking is, of course, there's been discussion over time whether it was going to be enlarged or what. So I just wanted to pose a question. The Tampa Bay Next, does that stay in the same concrete footprint?
Okay, so it really varies by location. Currently, our policy is that if express lanes exist, that the transit would operate in the express lane as opposed to a separate transit lane adjacent to the express lane. So under the current policy, for instance, in Howard Franklin Bridge, the express bus transit would operate within the express lanes. And then as we build the express lane south to go into downtown St. Pete, which is scheduled to start in 2024, that would also go into the express lanes. Now, once you get across the Howard Franklin Bridge, when we have the West Shore interchange constructed and segment 5, which goes up to the river, you'll actually have a dedicated transit way that will be in there. So you're going to have a separate transit corridor in the median. Once you get north of I-4, the concept would be, because we're not going to have express lanes up there, that the buses could operate on a shoulder that's probably a few feet wider than what the normal highway shoulder would be, but that would be where the buses would operate. And that would take you up to Bears, where the Tampa Bay Next program improvements currently end.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions?
Yes, I have another question for Secretary Gwen regarding the statements you just made.
Pat, you're recognized.
Thank you. Secretary Gwen, we've asked this before because it was originally put forth that somehow this plan would take 5 years, whereas the CSX tracks would take 10, which is not at all accurate in terms of transferring or making those tracks if we started with that progress or that idea. Transforming them to commuter rail in 10 years, they said it would take, even though it only took 5 actual years in Orlando. But it was said that this would be available in 5 years. But to be clear, I've asked this question before. You stated first off that these lanes there would not be these express lanes existing for at least till 2030, 2028.
Under current funding, Howard Franklin Bridge should be completed in about 2024 to 2025. The West Shore interchange all the way up to the river would likely be completed in the 2028, 2029 range. And the other segments, the segment going south down to St. Pete, the express lanes would be completed about the same time as the West Shore interchange, maybe a little earlier, 27. And the other segments are not currently funded.
At this time, has there been any approval for a lane, as you say, in the median of I-275 from West Shore to downtown?
Yes, that's part of the segment 4 and segment 5 construction. And in that segment, there's actually a transit way that would connect to the future West Shore Intermodal Center. So it wouldn't operate in express lanes there. It would operate in its own transit way that would be open to this as well as any other local transit that would want to use it.
Right, but you're saying that lane internal is already approved and funded from West Shore to downtown Tampa.
Yes, as part of
Okay.
the West Shore interchange improvements.
Okay. Okay. My other is that you didn't address anything from I-275 north of downtown. You went across I-4 to 75 as I heard it. You didn't address TB Next as it comes from the interchange north of downtown Tampa to out to Bears or Pasco. You didn't address that in your comments. And that will require widening more than, as Commissioner Seal asked, more than the current pavement. What you're talking about there is adding, and what you didn't talk about the funding for that already in place, at least partially, to put add 2 additional 12-foot lanes, so 24 feet of pavement, besides activating 2 lanes that are already existing that aren't being used at this time. So we're talking about an additional 24 feet of pavement and activating 2 more lanes. Is that correct?
No, not exactly. So there is one segment of basically from I-4 north to north of Hillsborough Avenue that is going to be starting construction later this year, or not this calendar year, this fiscal year, so sometime in 2021. And that is to provide 1 additional general purpose lane in each direction. So you go from 3 to 4. And as part of that, we would widen the shoulders out, I believe, from 12 feet to 15 feet. So in some places, there's already pavement out there that we're going to use, but in other places, we have to widen out. So it's not uniform through that whole corridor. Some places we may not have to widen, but a few feet. Other places we may have to widen 15 to 20 feet. But it's all within the existing right-of-way. So it's not going to require additional right-of-way. Now, north of Hillsborough Avenue, there is no current funding program for that. It is obviously in the long-range plan and in the priority list, but it's not funded for construction at this time.
Okay. And the plan that you're putting forward with TB Next is to have an additional 24 feet of pavement north of Hillsborough Avenue, 2 12-foot lanes, correct?
Again, it varies. It's not 24 foot everywhere. In some places, out there, we already have some very wide shoulders that haven't been used, and those we would just use those shoulders areas. In some places, it's smaller than that. In other places, especially as you get further north towards Beers, we would